Good evening, everybody. I'm Eric Goldstein. I'm the Judith London Evans Director of the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies here at Emory, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Tenenbaum Family Lecture in Judaic Studies. Tonight's audience is a hybrid one. We have both an in-person audience here in Ackerman Hall in the Carlos Museum, and we also have many viewers on Zoom, so I welcome both groups and thank you for attending. As many of you know, the Tenenbaum Lecture is a longstanding tradition at Emory, and it was inaugurated 25 years ago in 1997 to honor the family of the late Meyer Tenenbaum of Savannah, Georgia, a distinguished graduate of both Emory College and the Emory University School of Law. And each year, it brings a distinguished scholar of Jewish studies to campus to address students, faculty, and the broader community on topics of interest and contemporary importance. The driving force behind the establishment of the lecture was Samuel Tenenbaum, also an alumnus of Emory College, who dedicated it in honor of the entire Tenenbaum family and its ethic of community service. Sam and his wife Inez Tenenbaum, who live in Columbia, South Carolina, have been stalwart supporters of our program and of Emory more broadly for many years, and we could not have this wonderful program each year without their support and generosity. Although they're unable to join us tonight in person, they are watching on Zoom, and I would like to ask you to join me in recognizing them. We're honored tonight to have with us Professor Hava Tirosh-Samuelson of Arizona State University to speak on Judaism and climate change. In a minute, I will call on my colleague, Professor Jonathan Crane, to introduce our distinguished lecturer. But first, I'd like to inject a personal note. This visit is a bit of a homecoming for Professor Tirosh-Samuelson because she taught here at Emory in the early years of her career in the 1990s. And in fact, she was my teacher. I don't know if some of you know that I was an undergraduate at Emory. I'm grateful to her for her guidance and instruction she gave me in those years. And so I'm especially pleased to be able to welcome her back to our podium tonight. And before I hand over the microphone to Professor Crane, I just want to thank those who have contributed to making tonight's program a success. First, our co-sponsors, the Hightower Fund, the Center for Ethics, the Bill and Carol Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, the Climate at Emory Initiative, the Department of Environmental Studies, the Department of Religion, the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life, and the Office of Sustainability Services. And finally, I'd like to thank our TAM Institute staff members, Executive Director Paul Entis, Communications Coordinator Brent Buckley, and Senior Academic Program Coordinator Mallory Mebab for everything they've done and are doing to help this event run smoothly. Thank you. And last, but certainly not least, I want to thank Professor Jonathan Crane, who is the chair of this year's Tenenbaum Lecture. It was Jonathan who conceived the topic for tonight's program and has led the planning for the event. He is the Raymond F. Shinazi Scholar of Bioethics and Jewish Thought in the Center for Ethics at Emory. And it is my pleasure to both recognize him for his hard work on this program and also to ask him to come forward to introduce this evening's speaker.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Hava Tirosh-Samuelson, the Regents Professor of History, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Director of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. As a Jewish intellectual historian, Professor Tirosh-Samuelson's scholarship ranges across vast and diverse fields as philosophy, mysticism, science, ecology, technology, medicine, feminism, Renaissance history, bioethics, media studies, and of all things, happiness studies. To say that she touches on most every topic imaginable is perhaps not an overstatement. It was a decade ago at one of the annual meetings of the Judaism, Science, and Medicine group, which she organizes with flair and passion, when I was first introduced to Professor Tirosh-Samuelson. With yours truly as the exception, she had gathered luminaries from across North America, Europe, and Israel for a stimulating investigation into the biomedical and ethical issues surrounding obesity and Judaism's perspectives thereon. In our conversations, I soon learned that I had to be quick. for Professor Tirosh-Samuelson rarely sits still for long, intellectually speaking. If this year we are discussing obesity, next it will be narratives in bioethics, then transhumanism, then disability, family planning, and shortly thereafter, end-of-life issues. This year, the group's conference is on Judaism and public health, living in the shadows of a pandemic, and it is next Sunday. Her energy, enthusiasm, and creativity may lead her on a peripatetic scholarly adventure, but it is an infectious mix many want to join. To say that her work attracts the attention and applause of scholars, community leaders, and civil society more broadly is to put things mildly. One theme that has long piqued her curiosity is the environment. Her 2002 edited volume, Judaism and Ecology, Created World and Revealed Word, became an instant resource for the still young yet maturing field of religious environmental studies. She taught courses, gave lectures, and periodically published on these themes, convinced, and rightly so, that Judaism has much to offer contemporary deliberations on these increasingly urgent concerns. Unlike many others in this field, Professor Tirosh-Samuelson's approach is not apologetical, dogmatic, or Pollyannish. Rather, she finds that, quote, Judaism harbors a genuine tension in regards to nature that can be traced to the relationship between two of Judaism's central beliefs, the belief that God created the universe and the belief that God's will was revealed to Israel in the form of law, the Torah. Like in so many ways of life and ethics, Judaism's approach to environmental issues cannot be reduced to simple maxims or shallow thinking. Robust and critical engagement with the Jewish textual tradition and the lived experiences of Jews is needed, especially when it comes to something so multidimensional and pervasive as climate change. It is on this existentially burning topic that we are honored to hear tonight her most recent thoughts. Please join me in welcoming to the podium my inspiring, provocative, and insightful friend and colleague, Professor Hava Tirosh-Samuelson.
So, good evening, everyone, here in the hall and on Zoom, wherever you are. And thank you, Jonathan, for this very kind and rather personal introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in your 25th annual Tenenbaum lecture of the TAM Institute. And I would like to thank all the people who put it together. I would like to thank the various units that support this lecture. I'm very sorry that members of the Tenenbaum family are not going to be with us in person, but I will see one of them tomorrow on Zoom as well. Looking forward to that. And I would like to particularly thank Paul Entis and Brent Buckley for putting together all the mechanics of this lecture. So, I'm going to speak about a very burning topic, as Jonathan just said, and that is the climate. So the climate is changing, and we people have brought this change about by our action. Climate change is a challenge that would concern us all, and it crosses religious, political, ethnic, and ideological divides. Since we are responsible, climate change is not a mere scientific fact to which there will be a techno-scientific solution, but a moral issue that affects all people, rich and poor, in the developed and developing countries, in the North and the South hemispheres, in mountainous and coastal regions, in religious and in secular societies. It's true that climate change does not affect us all equally, but it does affect us all. Most importantly, climate change impacts all diverse ecosystems and the forms of life they support and nourish. So that climate change will determine whether Earth will be habitable or inhabitable. So let me go down to the first. So many of you are aware of the latest IPCC report. I'll just read the segment that you see on the screen. that came from just February 28th, saying the following: the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. The report offers solutions to the world. That's the opening statement, right, of this very important report. And you know that the time frame we're talking about is very short indeed. It's only until 2030 that we have some time to correct action. And the IPCC report made it clear that since climate change is accelerating and climate hazards have worsened significantly in the past decades, if warming is not slowed, the dangers will multiply and it will become harder and harder to cope with it. Addressing climate change today will determine the future of the planet tomorrow and for generations to come. Put simply, coping with climate change is the task of the 21st century. Let's take a few pictures of some visual images you're familiar with. I won't tell you which one we're from, but all of them are familiar to you. So what does it mean to experience climate change? It means to experience extreme weather events, devastating storms, frequent and destructive floodings, persistent droughts, melting polar ice caps, retreats of glaciers, rising sea levels and coastal erosion, thawing of the permafrost. I don't have any picture to illustrate that, but you know what I'm talking about. Change of seasonal cycles, destructions of habitats and ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, destructive wildfires, prolonged heat waves, decline of fecundity and fertility, and the list can go on and on. So this is the reality. And we have known that that's what's coming quite a long time ago. So here is a person that probably is familiar with some of you. That's Clive Hamilton. In 2010 already, he wrote this book, Requiem for Species. And he made it very clear that we have known about the pending challenges of climate change, but we refuse to accept the truth about global warming, because politicians, transnational corporations, and the public have denied or refused to act on the reality of climate change. Wishful thinking, ideologies, consumerism, active lobbying, and misinformation by the fossil fuel industry and political power games have prevented us from acting, while it was still possible to prevent climate change, or at least significantly slow it down. But now we have less than a decade in which we change course, or we might change course, and act in ways that will require serious sacrifice from all of us. We have no choice but act correctly. We are running out of time. That was his message in 2010. Let's keep in mind that climate change is a multifaceted problem that impacts every aspect of life: the physical environment, human health, economics, social relations, infrastructure, water and energy, architecture, agriculture and food production, national security, geopolitics. Again, you can add more items to this list. So climate change, first and foremost, as I understand it, is a social issue, because climate change will reduce access to food and clean water. It will cause millions of desperate refugees to flee floods, storms, and areas that will become uninhabitable. It will increase the potential for war. It has already done that. And it will make many societies less secure and more vulnerable. So as the IPCC report makes clear, given the pacing of global warming, in order to prevent catastrophes, nations will have to sharply reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases that are dangerously heating the planet. The problem is that the pace of global warming is faster than humans can adapt by adopting new practices and ways of life. We are now living through climate emergency because the trends of climate change will become irreversible. So here are the questions for tonight. Since I was asked to speak about Judaism and climate change, here are the questions. So is Judaism part of the problem of the ecological crisis or part of the solution? How does Judaism help does frame the moral challenges we face with climate change and the environmental degradation it brings about. And the third question would be, what have Jews done and are still doing to face challenges of climate change? I'm not going to keep you in suspense. Here are the major points that I'm going to suggest during the lecture. Climate change should be understood as part of the broader crisis of massive environmental degradation and collapse. So I see climate change as part of the ecological crisis, not separate from it. Second point, American Jews were aware, that would be my claim, American Jews were aware of it since 1965. But climate change emerged as a major issue only in 1998, after the refusal of the US to affirm the Kyoto Agreement. The Jewish tradition articulates an ethics of care and responsibility, I would argue, that sees a causal connection between social issues and environmental issues. Next point would be that since the mid-1980s, and more so since the mid-1990s, grassroots Jewish environmentalism has greened American Judaism. Jewish environmentalism is currently a recognizable strand in the diaspora and in Israel. Finally, climate advocacy today is one distinct emphasis within the environmental movement, and it's very appealing, especially to young Jews who really are concerned about climate justice. So the bottom line of my talk is that Judaism can and should be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Now, this last point is important because the story began, the conversation about environmentalism and religion began with this person, Lynn White Jr. Many people are familiar with his talk that he gave in December 1966, but it appeared as an essay in 1967, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And he basically argued that the Bible is the source of the problem, that everything goes back to Genesis 1:28, in which the human is commanded to master and rule the earth. And the Bible really created or gave mandate to humanity to utilize the resources of the world only for its own benefit. And White has, I think correctly so, said that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion. And he argued that, I'm quoting now, more science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. So rethink our old one, that's exactly what is happening in this field that is known as, under various names, either as religion and ecology, or as religion and the environment, or as religion, culture, and nature. But all of those formulations basically do certain things. The field today has generated a lot of monographs and edited volumes, essays, conferences, blogs, and even movies. And the assumption of the field is that religious traditions understand human nature relations, and the way they understand human nature relations is relevant to human action. So if we want to address the eco-crisis and climate change, we must pay attention to religion, because world religions harbor considerable environmental wisdom. Therefore, we need to recover or revive and reinterpret and reconstruct the wisdom of our own religious traditions to face the massive degradation that we have brought upon us, perhaps because we didn't listen to the wisdom of our own tradition. So in this talk, that's what I will explain to you, try to explain. I will begin by talking first, trying to convince you that Americans actually knew about the problem relatively early, already in the mid-60s, 2 years actually before before Lynn White said what he said. And then I will argue that the Jewish tradition has a lot of resources to develop this ethics of care and responsibility. I will also, shed some light on some of the activists and some of the organizations that are relevant here. So let's start with really part one of the talk by looking at this statement from the Union for Reform Judaism, 1965. As I said, 2 years before Lynn White already said what he said. Environmental pollution is a crime against life, and that results from our highly industrialized mechanical society and exploding populations, afflicting areas both urban and rural throughout the world. Its effect going unchecked, if its effect going unchecked, can end only in the tragedy of the destruction of all human life on earth. And this is what the Union of Reformed Judaism is saying already in 1968. And the solution to this is to urge appropriate measures should be taken by local, state, and national governments to remove or ameliorate the growing threats of environmental pollution and to afford protection to the environment. So my question now is, how did they get to know all this already in 1965? And the answer is these people. So I don't know if you can identify the people, but I'll start with the one on the top right. That's Robert Marshall. In case you're not familiar with him, he was the founder of the Wilderness Society, and he did so in 1934. To his left is Murray Bookchin, a very interesting person who is he is considered the father of social ecology. He was an eco-anarchist, a fascinating person. I just shared some conversation in our conversation with Jonathan and Eric. We discussed a little bit this interesting character. Under him, to the bottom left, is Barry Commoner. Barry Commoner, you're familiar with him. He's the one who articulated the 4 laws of ecology. And next to him is Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich is the person who is in the late 60s talked against overpopulation in his famous book on the population explosion. So again, I can give you a whole lecture just on these figures. We won't do it now. But my point is that already in the 60s, most of the challenges were there, or they were known. So when Reform Movement issued its warning about the tragedy of the destruction of all human life on earth, the evidence came from the writings of these secular Jews, or secularized Jews, who were committed to educating the public about the pending eco-crisis. Now, what happens next here, I'm going to give you some evidence from the various strands of American Judaism, starting with Reform Judaism, but you'll see that Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and Orthodox Judaism all have done quite a lot of, or paid a lot of attention to the environmental crisis. So let's start with some reform, with the Reform Judaism. Here is kind of an outline of, I won't give you all the detail, it's too detailed, but you can see that just by looking at this chart, that what you have here, that since the mid-1960s, the Reform movement continuously engaged environmental matters, moving from concern about conservation of natural resources, this is what concerned Bob Marshall. So from conservation of natural resources to focus on environmental pollution, that was in 1969. And in the 1970s, they focused on energy policies, that was 1979. Then they were concerned about dangers from industrial toxins, that's in the early, that's 1983. And they came up with all sorts of resolutions, how to deal with a problem. And the resolution usually specified, let's take an issue like conservation of energy, and they put it in the following language: the conservation of energy must be the personal responsibility of every American. This is a statement that came out in 1977. And the statement urged all of us to sacrifice that all sacrifices necessary to achieve our goals should be borne equitably by all segments of our society, commensurate with their ability to bear such burdens. So the story is pretty clear that these issues, which are considered kind of secular issues, became they became understood in religious categories and require religious response. So already in the 70s, the Reform movement identifies various forms of mitigation. And let's see if it's on this one. Yeah, various forms of mitigating climate change. So I give you the date of the resolution, and you can see the continuous interest and the connection also. Look at the second statement there. This is from 2000, that protection of the vulnerable, so that's a social concern, a moral concern, is connected to the notion of sustainable development. So that connection between what we will call eco-justice and social justice is already understood. This is from 2000, so that makes a lot of sense. But my point is that the statements didn't mention climate change, but they did talk about mitigating practices such as energy audits to reduce energy use. They talked about retrofitting structures. They talked about introducing energy efficient techniques into new structures. So the bottom line is most of what we think needs to be done was already done, already recognized. 1990s is where the issues of environmental racism came to the fore and the focus on environmental justice. And that's not a coincidence, because in 1987 is when it became very clear that many landfills and environmentally hazardous facilities have been located in areas where the poor or African American or other marginal communities reside. So the issue of environmental justice was recognized in 1987. So it's not a coincidence in 1990s we have a response from the CCR speaking against environmental racism and environmental injustice. So what I want you to pay attention to here is that the CCR resolution is going to use religious language to talk about the challenge that's facing us as part of the eco-crisis. So the CCR resolution states that because all humans are created b'tselem Elohim, and since we are all equally God's children, we should all equitably share in the bounty and travails of the earth. So social justice, equality, fairness, these are all part of the conversation of how do we deal with this crisis. Again, if you the next quote down there is also putting to the fore the concept of religious responsibility. So climate change is not just a secular issue; it's a religious issue from the very from the get-go. If you read those resolutions of the CCR and the UAHC, you will find language such as integrity of creation, equitable distribution of responsibility, or another statement would be our nation's responsibilities to reduce global carbon emissions. So the bottom line is kind of very, very clear. We are dealing here with the social justice issue, and now we can go back to that talk. So here it is. It says climate change is a fundamentally social justice issue that marries our mandate to be good stewards. Stewards, usually the language that is used in this discourse among Jews and Christians and Muslims, I should say, of the earth, with our call to care for the least among us. So that's basically the rationale. That's the core of Jewish environmental ethics. A person that has made a lot of difference in the way Jewish thinking is going, especially after 2015, is a person known to all of you. Pope Francis I, I think, really has changed the nature of the global conversation by bringing a lot of information available to the general public, but also making climate change the focal point of his Laudato Si. Let me remind you that on December 12, 2015, at COP21 in Paris, this was a landmark agreement to combat climate change and to accelerate and intensify the actions and investment needed for a sustainable low-carbon future was reached. Most of the world nations, including the United States, signed the Paris Agreement, but as you all know, a year later in the Trump administration, America withdrew from it. So that actually would generate responses from Jewish organizations, especially Reform and Reconstructionist organizations, that clearly spoke against that withdrawal and really made it very clear that we need to deal with it because it's an ultimate ethical obligation. So the Reform movement clearly has been involved in it, but they're not alone in it. So no less involved is the conservative movement. Conservative Judaism has also came up with a number of statements and resolutions. It's interesting that both Reform and Conservative, and I should say across the board, everybody uses the same biblical verses in order to make the case. And what you have are resolutions whether it's concerning opposition to legislation that would undermine laws that safeguard the environment, that's 1995, or you're talking about protection of diversity of our species in the environment, or you call for legislation to promote global environmental health, or you're talking about reduction of toxic waste. All these issues come out of conservative of the Rabbinical Assembly and other conservative bodies. And clearly my point is that you cannot deal with environmental issues unless you mobilize the language of the religious tradition. I want to bring to your attention this particular person. That's Lawrence Troster. Unfortunately, he passed away 2019, but he was very involved in interfaith work, primarily through his association with Green Faith. He was really one of the important early environmentalists, and I would like to mention him because we were very close friends, and it's really sad that he's no longer with us. But the point here is that the conservative movement has come up with various approaches to mitigate climate change, and all those mitigation practices, whether it's to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to provide financial incentives such as carbon tax, or to enforce high regulation standards or regulate harmful chemicals and substances and aggressively support pollution prevention measures. All of those things were endorsed by the Rabbinical Assembly, and clearly these are some of the points that are in the Green New Deal. So just keep in mind that if you want to figure out where to locate this approach, here it is. So when did climate change become the this is just a few examples of interfaith organizations, and I understand that here you have an interfaith Power and Light of Georgia, right? You told me that there are people from this organization joining us tonight. So I actually think that interfaith organizations and interfaith collaboration is very important in attempting to address climate change. But look at the quote that I put there. This is from 2016. This is from the Rabbinical Assembly. It is Jewish responsibility to address global climate change and work towards environmentally responsible energy policy. So you cannot talk about climate change without talking about energy policy, and you have to do it on personal, communal, and national levels. So concern for climate change really became the issue since 1998. And there are many examples that I won't give you all the details, but the very fact that we have the concept of Jewish responsibility tells us where we need to go. The conservative movement came up with this Green Covenant as a kind of an overview. It's a commitment. Again, look at the religious language in order to deal with problems such as carbon neutrality. So this is actually, Jonathan, we talked about post-secularism over dinner. So this is kind of an example of what a post-secular discourse would look like as far as environmental issues is concerned. So we have this, we have the problem, we have the solutions, and we kind of know where we need to go. These are some of the activities that were recommended by the Rabbinical Assembly of the conservative movement. And again, you can see that I'm sure you're familiar with all of these practices, what needs to be done, and how we can cope with this changing environment. I want to get to here where the concept of sustainability really becomes kind of an organizing concept that it's a shared language that results in various actions, and the little farming that you see on the right bottom, that picture is very important aspect of Jewish environmentalism today. So how to revive farming here in the United States by Jews, and how this type of farming can be done in urban setting as a response to climate change and the challenges. On this slide, you will see, I just put a few examples of Jewish environmental organization. COGIL, Coalition of Environment and Jewish Life, was the most important organization in the 1990s. Today, it's no longer the case. Today, Chazon is the most important organization. It has many initiatives, many programs, and including this seal of sustainability that Chazon uses. And basically, again, if I were to give you a whole list of things, we will have to spend here much more than 1 hour. So greening Judaism is happening, and it's taking place right now. The Reconstructionist movement also was very involved in it. These are some of the areas that they talked about since the 1980s. You will see all of those environmental challenges. And again, you see the same kind of rationale being articulated by the Reconstructionist movement. Now you may say, okay, these are all just the progressive or more left-leaning kind of organization. That's not a good word, but kind of more progressive, more liberal versions of Judaism. And that's actually not the case, because modern Orthodoxy too is involved in that effort. And here, the point here that you can create, articulate Torah-based environmental education, and as long as it's done within the language of not just the biblical text, but also the rabbinic interpretation of the biblical text, you can actually develop orthodox environmentalism that is going to be amenable and acceptable to Orthodox Jews. So I gave you just one example of Kanfei Nesharim. Kanfei Nesharim today is together with Grow Torah, and that merger of those two separate organizations is intended to the focal point there is what they call Torah-based environmental education, and they're primarily active in schools. But if you look at the activities of modern Orthodox organization, conservative, Reconstructionist, Reform, you're not going to see much difference between what they do. And on the ground, what they do is very much the same. This is just to tell you that there's also development of environmental halacha. Here is Tanchum Yorev from University of Toronto, who is an Orthodox Jew and very active environmentalist. The title of the book above, this is the cover of his book. He translated Bal Tashchit, if you know that principle of Bal Tashchit. He translated nicely into waste not, rather than do not destroy. But that book, I would highly recommend if you're interested to see how then he gives you the entire history of the discourse on this principle of Bal Tashchit. And the argument here is that there can be environmentally concerned halacha. There is, especially in Israel, quite a lot of new developments concerning environmental issues that you deal with them through halachic psika, halachic jurisprudence. So I will just bring it to our own day. There's one mistake at the thing that Naftali Bennett has another T in his name, but before Naftali Bennett went to Glasgow, 43 modern Orthodox rabbis, I don't know if you know those names, I'm not going to mention to you, but I bring this citation to you to realize that they urged Naftali Bennett to really look at Naftali Bennett himself, is a modern Orthodox Jew, and they put it very simply. We believe Jews should be on the front of effort to help avert a climate catastrophe. Making this even more important is that Israel is especially threatened by climate change. So everybody who knows about Israel and the climate of Israel really understand that point, but the bottom line is, yes, the halachic tradition has a lot to say, and climate change is an issue of interest to modern Orthodox Jews, especially in Israel. Now, if you ask me what happened in the United States, there was a joint committee, a joint group of people across the denominational spectrum that did a Tfilat HaDerech for President Biden. And in that, if you read it, it's very interesting. Through your blessing, may the president, through your blessing and through divine blessing, may the president lead the world to take the swift, ambitious actions needed to protect this common home, your earth, so that future generations inherit a just, sustainable, and bountiful world. The reference to the earth as a common home, that's of course from Laudato Si of Pope Francis I. And that's just to give you a sense of how a lot of these people recognize the power of this religious language that is very relevant to our most contemporary challenges. I did not mention one group, and that's the Jewish renewal movement. I'll get to them when I'm going to speak about Arthur Waskow, who represents the Jewish renewal movement and has been one of the most important climate advocates. So now the second part, in part two of the talk, I will actually go rather quickly over some of those issues. You can see my book on Judaism and ecology is on the top right. Another book, if you want just one book to take home and read and see how you connect Judaism and environmentalism, I highly suggest the Jeremy Benstein book. Jeremy Benstein is an American Jew who made Aliyah to Israel, one of the most important environmentalists in Israel, and he does so as a religious Jew. And the book, Judaism and Environmental Ethics, was edited by Martin Yaffe. And what you have here, and that section I will go through pretty quickly, some of the principles that you can find within the Jewish traditions and that anchor Jewish environmental ethics. So of course, Bal Tashchit, or the prohibition on wanton destruction and waste, that's a very important theme. You'll find an essay in the book about that. You'll have discussion about protection of biodiversity. You have discussion on the limits of human consumption. Limits of human consumption, that's what the kashrut system is all about. It's a lot about limits, putting limits on human consumption. There's a concern for animals suffering or they causing undue distress to animals. That's a principle of Tsar Ba'alei Chaim. A concern for future generations. We have a lot of biblical texts that are relevant to that. Of course, the Sabbath is a very important environmental principle. Because on the Sabbath, we don't consume, or we don't have to consume as much as we normally do, and we don't engage in any productive activity. And of course, the sabbatical year. So those are some of the principles that all Jewish environmentalists are coming back to these principles that led to the articulation, and that's maybe, let me say, kind of a word about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee. Here, the main point that Jewish environmentalists draw out of it is the connection between social justice and eco-justice. The concept of eco-kashrut or eco-kosher has been very important, has been articulated by Zalman Schachter Shalomi and popularized by Arthur Waskow. And these are the assumption here is that Judaism provides us kind of a normative framework for acts of justice and loving kindness that can make the imperfect world more just, more peaceful, and more fecund. So there's always a connection between eco-kashrut and tikkun olam, the value of tikkun olam. So clearly, Jewish environmentalists have a lot to work with. It's not directly about climate change, but it's about what we need to do about the environmental crisis, and it can be applied to climate change. So for example, one application that was done on the ritual level has to do with Tisha B'Av. The Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning that commemorates the destruction of First and Second Temple, has been associated recently, as of 2016, I believe it was the first time, with climate change. So try to think of climate change in the context of Tisha B'Av. So what's the bottom line here? It's very simple. Jewish environmental movement has offered a new prism through which to interpret Judaism in response to contemporary existential challenges, of which climate change is the most severe. So clearly, we have all the resources we need, biblical, rabbinic, philosophical, Kabbalistic, Hasidic, and all of those resources have been worked through and worked out and interpreted and reinterpreted in order to articulate a Judaic approach to environmentalism. So now, kind of the last section of the talk has to do, this is the connection between eco-kashrut and eco-justice. You'll see some of those some of those logos, but that's a very important theme right now that a lot of people share. So if you ask me, what does activism stand for? What do Jews do who are environmentally concerned? This is what the environmental activism what does it consist of? So you promote sustainable practices, you reduce consumption, you plant community gardens, you do sustainable agriculture, and you show Jews who are urban people how to connect sustainable agriculture with their urban lifestyle. You can talk about various environmental issues in an educational setting, and personally, I believe that that's the most important thing for us to do, to start environmental education from a very young age. You can organize nature walks and outdoor activities. You can celebrate the holidays in new ways, or pay attention to the agricultural resources of many of Jewish festivals. You promote justice in food production, and you pay attention to sustainable agriculture and compassionate treatment of farm animals. So you can do a lot. There's no shortage of what you can do. But as of after 1998, the focus is going to be primarily on climate change as almost like a focal point of environmentalism. So here's Arthur Waskow, probably the most important person in the history of Jewish environmentalism and in climate change. I'll just give you a few of his books. The one to the right is his latest book, and that really has a long section on climate change, so you are welcome to read it. He's done his work through the Shalom Center. It's associated with the Jewish Renewal Movement, but it really is a self-standing thing, a self-standing entity. And here are a few points to bring in mind when we think about Arthur Waskow, Rabbi Arthur Waskow. Evoking Mishnah Tractate Avot 114, if not now when, Waskow relentlessly claimed that climate change is the Jewish issue of our time. And he appealed to Jews and non-Jews, and now I'm quoting, to reflect upon the impact of climate change on this holy temple that is our planet Earth, to turn and take action, large and small, toward a better future. So Waskow, as some of you know, is a serious social critic, and has been very critical of the energy policies that has been put in place in the United States. Not only does he push for eco-kosher, he's the person behind the idea of eco-kosher, but he also critiqued what he called, and I'm quoting now, the burning and extraction of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and methane, and the destruction and development of critical habitat and vast forests, all of which contribute greatly to climate crisis, which is commonly called global warming, but which is actually human-fueled imbalance in our global climate system. So who is to blame? Well, he speaks a lot through the language of the Bible, especially the narrative of Exodus, and he uses the language of carbon pharaohs. So the carbon pharaohs are the people responsible. Namely, the carbon pharaohs of our day are the transnational corporations that are engaged in the extraction industry. And he is not shy to accuse members of the Jewish community who want to talk about energy independence or energy security. And he's saying to them, no, you're on the wrong side here. You have to do the right side. And for him, the right side is the Green New Deal. So in 2014, Waskow called on Jews to bring our own ancient wisdom and our own modern political clout and smarts into the service of God's earth by recovering and practicing the laws of the sabbatical year. In 2019, he joined the strike for climate action and all those organizations, including 350.org and Friends of the Earth and other groups who pushed for the Green New Deal. So clearly, if you want a prototype, he's your person. But he's not alone. I think I have here's some of his advocacy. You can see a reference to the global climate change and to the Green New Deal. He's clearly the major voice, but he's not alone. There are other, in October 29, 2015, over 500 rabbis signed the rabbinic letter on the climate crisis, and it was influenced clearly by the plans to publish Laudato Si. So the rabbinic letter, and here is across the board, it's interdenominational, and it calls for vigorous action to prevent worsening climate disruption and to seek eco-social justice. So any discussion of eco-social justice is due to him. Here is some reference here's a reference to the rabbinic letter. And again, what you see in this rabbinic letter, which critiques the extreme extraction of fossil fuels, the fracking of shale rock for oil and what he would call unnatural gas, disease-causing coal burning, extracting and pipelining of the tar sands that threatens First Nation communities and deep offshore drilling. So he's very critical of what has been done, and he's not alone. This is recognized also by a good number of rabbis. So clearly we have an awareness of what's going on and what can be done about it. So here's a summary, kind of some of the points that were mentioned by the rabbinic letter. But I want to suggest to you that there are several organizations that deal just with climate change. So I'll move to the next slide. And these are organizations. So Dayenu is a relatively recent one. Dayenu, a Jewish call for climate action. Chazon, we already mentioned. Chazon is very involved in that. But also we have the Jewish Climate Action Network. And if you look at what these organizations do, they basically do more or less the same thing. They are engaged in education. They're engaged in activism. They're engaged in organizing. And what they're trying to do is to shift and to shape our attitudes toward those problems. So I would like to mention primarily say a few more words about Chazon. And Chazon, which was founded in 2000, created something very important for our future, and that's the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. It was founded by Chazon in 2019, and I think that kind of focus on the youth as the kind of direction that we need to go, that to me actually is a cause for hope. So if you go on the website of this initiative within the Chazon website, you will encounter our hope for the future. We have college boys and girls who are deeply concerned about and care to engage climate change. Their personal narratives and testimonies make clear that they are deeply concerned about the existential crisis that will face them as they will grow into a world with diminished biodiversity, growing insecurity, water shortages and droughts, heat waves, climate refugees, and all the other challenges that I mentioned already in the beginning of the lecture. So to conclude, and here's kind of what Jewish climate change looks in action. So mostly what you do is you protest, you march, you educate. I gave you a slide from Jenny Rosen. She's the woman who put together, or she heads the Dayenu organization. And this is just to get you a sense of the kind of vitality and vibrancy that is going on in this conversation. So as we look to the future, and this is what happened in Glasgow just most recently. This is the kind of a summary of the Climate Pact. And you see how the entire world gets together. And Judaism is just part of the conversation. It's a small part, but it's a very relevant part. So where do we end? We have to end, I think, by looking at the image at the bottom of this screen. We have an option. We can have it either. We can have a green future or we can have the brown future. I would like to bring to your attention a statement from that was issued by 40 religious leaders who were convened by Pope Francis I in the meeting before COP26. And they said, "We have inherited a garden. We must not leave a desert to our children." So that's basically our challenge, I would say. If we fail to act now, we will harm the world that was created by God and given to us as a gift to cherish and protect. In this lecture, I sought to show that there is no contradiction between Judaism and environmentalism. A concern for the well-being of the environment and for dangers of climate change is a very Jewish issue. It is a moral issue that we as Jews address within the framework of Judaism. As I've shown, environmental degradation and environmental problems were recognized by the leadership of the Jewish community at least since the mid-60s. And nature conservation, pollution, energy policy, environmental racism, environmental justice, and climate change have engaged all strands of modern Judaism. These topics have been engaged theologically and ethically, and the key idea is that we are responsible for the well-being of the world that God had created. Since 1998, there had been considerably attention to climate change as the most existentially significant dimension of eco-crisis, but not the only one. Today, there are numerous Jewish organizations and initiatives that are engaged in environmental education, and some focus exclusively on climate change. So to make an impact, we will need to make climate change a central concern of Jewish education, and I would argue that we need to start at a very young age. Jewish institutions have done a lot, but they can do more, or we can all do more. And I would say, just keep in mind that I would say, again, it's something that I've written quite a lot about. If we start at a young age and we bring children to really care about environmental issues and to develop the character traits, what is known as virtues, that can deal with environmental challenges, we can do quite a lot. So we started the lecture by looking at the disturbing images of the climate, of climate change, what it entails. And I want to end with hope rather than despair. Although we have only a small window of opportunity in which to act, our hope is to be found in our youth, in people like Greta Thunberg of Sweden, as well as in the high school and college students who serve on the board of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement and many other similar grassroots organizations of Jews and non-Jews. These young people, including college students who take our courses on religion and environment, give me hope that we do possess the energy and the commitment necessary to address the challenges of climate change. Technological innovations will undoubtedly be part of the human attempt to address the challenges, but what we need even more is a change of heart, a change of attitude, and a change of outlook. So we have our resources, our tradition offers us religious, moral, and philosophical sources. We just need to do the work. So I'll end where I started originally. Addressing climate change is the task of the 21st century. Thank you.